if we want a working class that is able to be militant and to be a fighting working class, then that working class has to have a political purpose. It has to be able to challenge both domestic and foreign policy because they're essentially reflections of each other.
The task ahead of us, which is how do we build a labor movement that's able to extract material victories and materially weaken the Zionist entity and imperialism.
We're in a larger fight because we're contained within this settler colonial project.
For Zionism to be defeated, then its military complex has to be defeated. And the way that we can affect that is by going after the arms industry.
Welcome to Spring Radio, a podcast for socialist ideas in action. I'm Sarah Shahid, Spring member and co-host of the Spring Radio podcast. This month marks 1 year since Israel escalated its genocidal actions in Palestine. As of this recording, the Israeli occupation forces have murdered more than 40,000 men, women, and children in Gaza since October 7th, as confirmed by the Gaza Health Ministry. The total number is certainly much higher. The British medical journal The Lancet estimated in July that the number of Palestinians killed could be more than 186,000. We have seen grassroots solidarity and resistance in every section of society, from students to unions to neighborhood groups. In this episode, Spring member Ayaan Tani, a writer and visual researcher based in Toronto, sat down with Palestinian community organizer and trade unionist Moe Alqasem to reflect on the past year and what comes next. Their conversation, recorded on September 27th, touches on many topics, including the importance of unions in the struggle for Palestinian liberation, why the attack on union leader Fred Hahn was an attack on all workers, and the wider regional war that is developing because of Israel's aggression. This episode focuses on the here and now, but if you want to hear more from Moe on the history behind this current moment, he will also be speaking at this year's Red October Conference, hosted by Spring at the Toronto Metropolitan University from October 18th to 20th. His talk is on the fight against settler colonialism in Palestine from 1936 to 1939. You can find the link to purchase tickets in the episode description or through Spring's Instagram or Twitter. Following Ayaan and Moe's conversation, we have also included 2 short interviews recorded at this year's People's Conference for Palestine in Detroit. Ayaan speaks with Taher Dahleh, a member of the Communication Workers of America and the Palestinian Youth Movement. They also speak with Frank Hammer, a former president of the United Auto Workers Local 909. Ayaan asks them why unions are an important site of resistance for Palestinian liberation. So without further ado, let's get started with Ayaan's conversation with Moe Alqasem.
Thank you, Mo, for joining us today. Can you tell us a bit about yourself and your hometown?
Thank you for having me. So my name is Moe Alqasem. I'm Palestinian, originally from Nablus, which is a city in the West Bank. Been active in politics and organizing in Canada, and particularly around labor issues and Palestinian national liberation and Arab community organizing.
Amazing. And can you talk to us about what sparked your turn to activism? Was there a particular moment, or has it always been part of your life?
I think I was always predisposed to some type of political involvement. I grew up largely around the Arab world and have been in Palestine at different points in my life. So obviously living that reality kind of sparks a natural rage for any human being, right? So that was the precursor to all of this. But I think my time in Canada has really revealed to me a sense of apathy. And when I saw that apathy across society in different pockets, it really propelled me towards some type of community involvement and some type of political engagement, I would say. I think also seeing this illusion of Canada and North America being safe havens and these centers of development and progress and human rights and all of that. So that illusion just starting to dissolve in front of me as I lived in Canada. It really progressed that urge to get involved.
Yes, and you've gotten involved in labor in particular. How did you get into labor organizing? And can you talk a bit more about the importance of the labor movement for the fight for a free Palestine?
With labor organizing, I used to be a student at York University, so I spent a lot of time around the politics of that university, and I was pretty close to members of QP 3903. Shout out right there. So during a certain moment, there was a strike that was closing in. It was the 2018 strike by QP 3903. Of course, I was an undergraduate student at that time, but I spent a lot of time working with the graduate students, the PhDs, the research assistants, the teaching assistants. And through that, I learned a lot more about labor organizing and labor issues, at least in that sector, in the post-secondary sector, or the universities and colleges. And then through organizing in the wider city of Toronto, of course, there's a lot of hubs where labor is involved and labor activists are involved. And I've come to work closely with many of them. And many years later, when I was unionized with QP 1281, I became the vice president of that local. And then I became the president for 3 terms, which gave me a lot more insight and a lot more hands-on experience of handling negotiations and arbitrations and membership issues, right? And a lot more proximity to the institution of labor as a whole.
You'd written something a couple years ago, I think it was for Midnight Sun Mag, and it was about why Palestine is an important labor issue here. And there was a section in the article about how labor could be a tool for colonialism, and it spoke a little bit to what you said there about the institution of labor, how there are business unionists, how even in the state of Israel, unions were created in order to be a tool for settler colonialism. Can you expand a bit more about that, and if you notice those themes here in Ontario?
Oh, this is the question of the century. So let me start by saying that there's multiple ways of seeing trade unionism or seeing labor unions and developing them. The way I understand it in the most simple terms is it's a battle between business unionism and social unionism. For me, business unionism is creating an enterprise, almost corporate-like, that doesn't really seek to advance the interests of the working class socially and politically, but only seems to be interested in running after wage issues, quote unquote, wage and wage related issues, as if, they're devoid of politics and they're not deeply rooted in systems, right? And then there's social unionism, which of course advocates for better working conditions and better wages for workers, but also seems to understand it through the prism of politics in society, whether that is domestic politics or global politics, right? So that's something that we can see across the board in so-called Canada. You can see unions and trade unionists that seem to want to only focus on quote unquote bread and butter issues, or meat and potato issues, whatever the term is, and sort of separate themselves from all the social issues, social justice, politics abroad, and even a lot of the politics at home. In what is called the State of Israel, the Zionist State of Israel, there are trade unions, of course. And these trade unions have begun as an arm of Zionism. They're an extension of the Zionist project. So, of course, these trade unions also collect membership dues or membership fees from people that would come in their ranks. And, of course, with the history of colonialism and settler colonialism in historic Palestine, there will be Palestinian or Arab workers. A lot of these Arab workers and Palestinians would be forced to pay membership dues to the Israeli trade unions, but would receive none of the benefits, right? Or they would be paid less than their Israeli Jewish counterparts, workers. Of course, this understanding does not preclude the reality that trade unionism in historic Palestine, or Israeli trade unionism to be exact, has been built on really the blood of Palestinians and the dispossession of Palestinians. You don't have an Israeli working class that just emerged out of the blue. It's a working class that's emerged out of dispossessing Palestinians, removing them from their homelands, and then using them as a reserve labor army. So going back to the essence of the question, there is obviously a purpose in pursuing social justice abroad. The institutions that we're seeing function both in the global south and in North America and Europe, really all around the world, don't just reap the benefits and exploit people in one country or one continent, and then they leave out another people, a different side of the world. They exploit workers and peoples wherever they can. There's the argument that could be made, and it's often made, that if we want a working class that is able to be militant and to be a fighting working class, then that working class has to have a political purpose. It has to be able to challenge both domestic and foreign policy because they're essentially reflections of each other. They're extensions of each other, and they're extensions of the system that gave rise to the nation state that we have here. And in addition to all of that, the emancipation of another people in the global south is going to affect and is going to influence a lot of progress for us here. Take, for example, the industry of weapons manufacturing and arms manufacturing. This industry needs to be tackled at its root. And the workers there need to be in a position where they can challenge the private enterprises and really even the public enterprises that own this industry. They need to be able to take the industry, as much of it as they can, and transform it into something that can benefit larger society. We're in a climate crisis as of now. We could be working on a lot more technology, on a lot more green technology that could benefit society. Instead of exploiting workers here to create weapons and components to ship to a nation state thousands of miles across the sea to bomb brown and black people in the global south. So for me, this is an obvious connection.
Yes, I think it's important that you note that workers must take an internationalist stance. The first BDS resolution 50 that was passed by QP Ontario was in 2006. It was a response to a call from Palestinian workers. It was supported by the Congress of South African Trade Unionists. That was nearly 20 years ago now. What gains has the labor movement here in Ontario made since then, and what more work needs to be done?
Right, that's a very good question. So QP Ontario is the political arm of QP as a national organization or as a national trade union. I think if it isn't the first one to pass a BDS resolution, it definitely was one of the first in North America. So it's definitely a point of pride. There's been a lot of progress since that BDS resolution has passed in 2006. We've seen many more unions take a position, whether it's a complete endorsement of the BDS campaign or a substantial endorsement of its components. As of very recently, OPSU has taken a position, a public position at that. Many, many years ago, Unifor has taken a position, Public Service Alliance of Canada. There's been positions taken up by the Ontario Federation of Labour and other unions across Canada and Quebec. There's a lot of work to be done in the sense that the resolutions need to be put into practice or need to be materialized at some point. I would say that the next goal for these resolutions is to target the arms industry or to target labor or production that is feeding the Israeli state or that is directly involved in the Israeli state's actions. This is the next big step ahead of us. We've seen trade unions across the world, really, across the global south and Europe, actually take that political position and enforce it as workers, as rank and file workers. One of the examples that comes to mind is the workers in Belgium who refused to transport arms cargo or weapons to the state of Israel.
Fred Hahn is the CUPE Ontario president. He's been a staunch supporter of Palestine and at the moment being subject to attacks from the right, Zionists, and his own union leadership, the CUPE National Board. Can you talk about why it's important that we stand with Fred Hahn and how this is important for the labor movement at large in Canada?
So there's two main facets of this story. Of course, Fred Hahn is a leader and a great leader at that. And I work with him on the Ontario Executive Board, and he's a very vocal person, and he's a very principled union leader. Then there's the facet of this is not a Fred Hahn issue. There's nothing that Fred Hahn has said, at least that comes to mind, that hasn't been instructed by the membership of CUPE. The position that him and many other leaders take is a position that has been informed by our membership across Ontario and even nationally, I would say. So there's going to definitely be a point in any union's lifetime where there's an internal debate or there's an internal discussion that happens. The issue is that this internal debate has become a public one for many reasons. And of course, the right wing, and particularly the Tories in this country, have taken the opportunity to weaponize this debate and to try to take down a principled trade union leader. And this isn't something new. We've seen trade unionists and union leaders be attacked over and over again, and the right wing trying to infringe our rights and our ability to take political positions. It's going to be very important to defend Fred Hahn as much as it is important to defend other union leaders on the issue of Palestine, because for one, the political establishment or the ruling elite would like nothing more than to see us silenced on global South issues and really on a lot of political issues domestically, right? The other part of that is there's definitely an attempt by the right wing to try and meddle with trade unions. What I mean by that is that they would like us to, quote unquote, remain focused on workers' issues as if they are friends of the workers, right? As if they cared about the working class to begin with. What they really mean to tell us is, we don't want you to focus on the grand scheme of things. We don't want you to focus on foreign policy. We don't want you to think about social change. We want you to keep chasing change in forms of pennies to $1. These small increases in your wages in reference to or in relation to skyrocketing prices and even further exploitation that we're seeing across the country, both in the public and the private sector. So to circle all the way back, I think there's definitely a path forward, or hopefully a path forward to reconcile. Fred is one of many political leaders who has been vocal on Palestine. He's perhaps the most vocal. The importance of defending him also relates back to domestic issues. We want trade union leaders who are able to connect with communities, and racialized and marginalized communities to be exact, and link arms with them and tell them your issues are our issues as well. The importance of defending him is actually making sure that we're seeing the big picture, that we're building a working class that is militant and that is willing to fight. We don't want a precedent to be set where a union leader could be taken down by external influence and for speaking his politics and his union's politics.
For sure. How have you seen a difference in activism over the past year as opposed to the kind of beginning of your foray into organizing for Palestine?
That's a very good question. I would say that at some point, our understandings of what's at play in historic Palestine have shifted or have evolved. For, I would say, some years, our understanding of what's happening in Palestine has been largely seen through the framework of apartheid and human rights abuses or human rights violations. That has transformed over the last few years, I would say, and it's crystallized more so in the last year and a half. So now we're beginning to understand settler colonialism and imperialism at play across the global south and across the region that we know as the Middle East and North Africa. How has it transformed over the last while? The activism has become a lot more, I want to say, militant. I want to say unwavering and confrontational. It's no longer an activism or a form of organizing where we're seeking to appeal to the ruling elite or the establishment. It's become a lot more demanding of them to actually sever their ties with Zionism. Of course, there is a long historic relationship between North America and the Zionist project, and they're not going to sever their relations anytime soon or easily, I would say. But I think the wider public has really begun to understand the role of the Canadian political elite and their connection to Zionism. I think too, it's become, I think the genocide has really shown all of the true colors of Zionism. There are some people in wider public or in society that wanted to see some sort of a resolve or resolution that included some appeasement to the Zionist project. But there's definitely a lot more people now that don't want to see Zionism continue as a project in the Middle East, and are starting to see the links between Zionism as a political idea and the rise of alt-right tendencies, the rise of anti-trade unionism, anti-workers, and really their connections with despotic regimes across the world and even in the global south. I think from this stage moving forward, we're combating Zionism and we're continuously exposing it for what it is, a settler colonial ideology.
Yeah, there's certainly been a lot of political education about what Zionist entity is all about. And we've seen multi-pronged approaches here, from like student encampments, riding group coalitions, healthcare workers for Palestine. But after the education has been done, where do we go next? Where do you think the struggle needs to go in the coming weeks or months?
Coming weeks, months, years, I think what we're witnessing right now is a regional war beginning to evolve or unfold right in front of us. I don't think the Zionist project or the Israeli state is going to back down without a fight. I think they're going to try and really defeat any of the forces, any of the political forces around them that are not willing to accept Zionism. So what that means for us in Canada is that we're going to have to wage a protracted struggle against it. I think the moment has long gone. It's way in the past. The moment that a ceasefire could have been called, or an early stop to the war could have been called. I think the only way that this war is going to stop is with a defeat to either side. For Zionism to be defeated, then its military complex has to be defeated. And the way that we can affect that is by going after the arms industry and the weapons industry here. This is a political project that has had no issues violating agreement after agreement, violating most, if not all, of the international humanitarian laws, some of them that they've signed on to. They've had no issues lying to the media internationally. They've had no issues causing enormous damage to civilian populations and non-combatant populations, and then turning around and saying that they're defending themselves throughout all of this. So to me, the conclusion for us is that we need to cut off the ammunition to that project or that regime. And let me add this, it's going to require much more than just the Palestinian and the Arab populations across Canada or North America or really the globe to be able to wage the struggle. It's going to require really every community with a conscience and with an appreciation and a love for humanity. Let's not forget that Israel and the Zionist project is really deeply rooted in a lot of the disputes and the wars and the violations that are happening across continental Africa. Or they're not connected somehow or have never been connected to the abuses and the violations and the wars that have been waged by the government in Sri Lanka against the Tamil people. That's just another example. Or they haven't been connected to the Marcos Duterte governments in the Philippines, which have committed massacres against the Filipino people. So really, every community has a stake in this fight.
Yeah, you were talking about arms embargo. On September 10th, Melanie Joly began her refrain again about how all arms exports since January have been paused, not mentioning that, every contract that was written up prior to January 8th continues to be honored. Canada still sends arms to Israel. How can we continue to ramp up the pressure on this government to make an arms embargo a reality?
I think continuing the strategies that have worked so far and continuing to create really a crisis for the political establishment, because essentially they're not going to employ an arms embargo if they don't get forced to. And the only time they're going to get forced to is if their interests are at a clash or if they're going to lose their leverage here at home. Obviously, Melanie Joly comes out of the Liberal Party of Canada, and they're headed towards an election at some point soon. So continuing that pressure, that consistent campaigning, getting the civil society institutions, the trade unions, the churches, the mosques, the synagogues, etc., all on board behind this call. And of course, confronting the manufacturers themselves, the enterprises, the private companies that partake in weapons manufacturing. But I feel like definitely there's going to be a lot more exposés written about weapons manufacturing and the arms shipments to Israel, because most of these deals are of course done from Canada directly to Israel, but there's still a lot of manufacturing of components and arms and whatnot that goes through the United States from Canada and then arrives at Israel. And that one, it's a bit more difficult to track. So that has to be exposed. It's definitely a point of progress that some permits have been withheld, but knowing the Liberal Party, knowing the Tory Party, knowing the Canadian political establishment, there's something they're probably not telling us or they're leaving out of the script. I think any self-respecting community or organizations have to really expel these politicians from our midst and actually stop them from pitching anything to us until their role is completely and transparently been severed, right? I wouldn't want to go to a masjid or a mosque or an Arab community center where there's a liberal oratory politician who's going to speak to me. I wouldn't want that for myself or for any community member.
Good. How do you see the geopolitical situation evolving in the coming months and years? What is Canada's place in this picture?
It's definitely become clear for all of us that the regional war is breaking out. And Israel has waged this war on multiple fronts. As we're speaking right now, they're bombing in Lebanon. When that happens, there's definitely going to be an involvement of forces in Lebanon, an increased involvement from Iraq, a possible retaliation from Iran, and even more involvement from Syria. By the way, Syria has been getting bombed consistently even before the war. It's been getting bombed by Israel. And of course, back and forth exchanges with Yemen. So what's going to happen in the coming stages is it's going to get a lot more bloody, a lot more horrific, and there's going to be more casualties. But there's going to be political fissures across the Arab countries neighboring historic Palestine. There's definitely a confrontation that is either erupting or going to erupt at some point between the populations of Jordan and Egypt with their own political establishments. Obviously, the populations of both Jordan and Egypt have been very complacent, and shameful towards Palestinians, and they've been very much tied with the Zionist project and the Israeli interests in the current war. Obviously, these don't reflect wider society or popular sentiment, so it's going to come to a head. What that looks like, I don't entirely know. Whether it's going to be mass protests and arrests, whether it's going to come into full uprisings in some of these countries, that really depends on what is the terrain on the ground and what are the political forces, the grassroots political forces that are active there. I don't think any of the other Arab countries in the Gulf are going to involve themselves all too much, or they're going to lean into the picture any bit more than they have to. I would imagine that the war is not exactly favorable for them either, because prior to all of this, they've been attempting to normalize relations with Israel. Some of them. Others have already normalized relations with the state of Israel. I would imagine that they would want to see the soonest resolve to the war, but one that actually defeats the Palestinians, so they can resume their business relationships with the state of Israel and their normalization project. And of course, their relation to the imperialist core, being the United States. What I will add is, I think at this very moment, Israel's attacks on Lebanon are actually a prelude to a ground invasion, or at least I think is the underlying reason. I don't think they're bombing for the sake of bombing. Of course, some of it is much more sadistic and malicious, but they're attempting to dismember the population and dismember the forces that exist in Lebanon, in the south and in central Lebanon, so they could have an easier time running a ground invasion there. Of course, in relatively recent memory, Israel has suffered a loss in Lebanon that is still hurting them. So when they lost in the 2006 war, they had to retreat. And a lot of the territory that they had previously occupied from Lebanon, they've receded from. There's the added element that when you're in a war, your political project is at stake, internally and externally. So we've seen the Zionist project fail to achieve a government time and time again prior to the war, and having to run multiple elections to achieve some form of a coalition government. And of course, that was Netanyahu's return to power. What's happening there is they're trying to get out of the war by finding a political victory. And the only way that this government, or really any other government that would be in power, so-called Israel, the only way that they can actually hold something up and say we've won is if they achieve some sort of a military defeat. So that's clearly not the case in Gaza. They're going to try and achieve that in Lebanon. They're looking for an escape out of this war. But for them to retain the cohesion of their political project, then they have to frame it as a victory, or even try to get a victory.
Cool, thank you. What are the kind of big takeaways you'd like people to have from this conversation?
I think the biggest takeaways is that we really have to brace ourselves for this protracted struggle against empire and against settler colonialism. We have to run sustained movement and a sustained struggle to be able to win. I think it's time that we've fully targeted the arms industry for all of the right reasons, not just being against the war that's being waged against Palestinians and Arabs in the region, but because also it's time to tackle private enterprise. It's time to actually think through climate change and try to affect the course that we're on. I believe that people have to begin seriously engaging the politics that they're seeing domestically and being active in their neighborhoods and in their communities and in their institutions, whether that is more political or ideological or religious or non-religious, etc., whether they're students or workers, unionized and non-unionized. The average person can get involved with the nearest thing that is available to them. So I would encourage every listener to find a way to be involved and to sustain that involvement. If Palestinians in Gaza can be steadfast for this long, then I believe we can do much more from our end.
Well said. Thank you so much, Mo.
Thank you.
Can you tell me your name and where you're coming from today?
Sure, my name is Taher Dahleh. I'm coming from a panel session on the role of unions in the Palestinian National Liberation Movement, and we're here at the People's Conference for Palestine in Detroit, Michigan.
Can you talk about the importance of unions as a site of resistance?
Sure, yeah. I think you can divide this question into maybe two overarching like umbrellas, and we can give details on both. I guess the first side of it, which I feel like most people have an intuitive understanding of, most people are workers in the world, you know what I mean? Most people understand that the companies that they work for depend very, very heavily on their labor, and if not for that labor, as it were, the base would kind of be ripped out and the company would come crashing down, and even more so the political system. And even despite the fact that, at least in America, I know this is for a Canadian audience, I know it's a little bit different up there, but I'll speak about the context I know better. We have a small labor movement. It's 9% of American workers are in a labor union. And even of that 9%, very few of them have experience on strike or engaged in any kind of concrete workplace struggle. That being said, I still think most people have an intuitive understanding of how powerful organized labor action, let's say, or organized action by working people on their jobs is for winning demands. And I think most of us in the Palestine movement also have that understanding. And so we have a task ahead of us, which is how do we build a labor movement that's able to extract material victories and materially weaken the Zionist entity and imperialism, generally speaking, until our people are free. So that's the first half, is the kind of material element. The second half, I think, is actually in some ways more immediate and feeds the first half, which is that When you look, there are many surveys have been done. I don't know the numbers offhand, but I'll just vaguely point to them that show that union workers tend to be more progressive, tend to be more open to left politics in general and just struggles in general than their non-union counterparts. And I believe that that's because unions, even when they don't do this as much as they should, manage to have an effect on people's ideas. They manage to execute political education. For example, in my union, Communication Workers of America, we have a study program called Runaway Inequality, and it kind of takes the membership through the history of financialization in the 1970s and the Reagan era neoliberalism and how that devastated our unions and devastated our welfare state and how that's weakened the entire working class. And also it emphasizes, the racial disparities in this weakening and so ties together basically in a way that's palatable how capitalism and racism interact with each other. So we can be doing this stuff right now with our coworkers around Zionism, and around fighting for a free Palestine through one-on-one worker-to-worker conversations or through other forums and unions that are willing to do it. In fact, they already have done it. For example, the Starbucks Workers Union, which is particularly inspiring for a number of reasons, and us, the Palestinian Youth Movement, have conducted several political ed sessions on Zoom for the Starbucks membership. I think the first one was kind of a Palestine 101, and then we did a history of the Nakba, and we have other stuff planned. So unions are, to sort of tie these two threads together, I think they're the largest, even when they're weak, they're the largest and kind of most developed expression of working class organization. And that gives them a unique ability materially, so to the first point, and also ideologically, which in this case I think would mean growing the numbers of the anti-Zionist movement or the pro-Palestine movement. So that's kind of what I would say to that.
Let's get you to say your name and where you're from.
My name is Frank Hammer, and I am from Detroit, Michigan.
Why are unions an important site of resistance for Palestine?
First of all, because Palestinian workers have appealed for the support of workers globally as just straightforward class brothers and sisters, that we have a common struggle against capital, and it's only natural that the labor movements of various countries, including especially the U.S., would come to the aid of Palestinian workers and their unions. But secondly, we're in a larger fight because we're contained within this settler colonial project. That's not only true for the status of Palestine and Gaza and the West Bank and so on, but we ourselves here in the U.S. are part of, what's been a settler colonial project. And so we have a way that we can identify that our own U.S. Ruling class, from its very beginnings, crushing the indigenous population in the U.S., that's a great similarity to what's happened in the settler project in Palestine, with Israelis wanting to create a settler state and subject the Palestinian people either to just oblivion, to elimination, or to be under the subjugation of the Israeli ruling class. So we have those international interests that unite us, and so any blow against the settler project globally is something that will be of help to U.S. workers as well.
My last question: what's your favorite protest chant?
The people united will never be defeated.
Thank you to Moe, Taher, and Frank for sharing their insights and experiences with Spring Magazine. You can follow Labor for Palestine on Instagram at Labor for Palestine and on Twitter at Palestine Labor. As mentioned before, Moe is also giving a talk at this year's Red October conference titled The Fight Against Settler Colonialism, Palestine 1936 to 1939. This is one of many talks at this year's conference, which will focus on the intertwining struggles against colonialism, capitalism, and imperialism. You can find the link to purchase tickets in the episode description or through Spring's Instagram or Twitter. You can also follow Frank Hammer on Twitter at Detroit Unionist and check out AFL-CIO-INT.education, a labor education website for the AFL-CIO Union. Finally, you can follow the Palestinian Youth Movement on Instagram at Palestinian Youth Movement and Twitter at PalYouthMVMT. This episode was produced in Tkaronto on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishnabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. It was produced by Ayan Tani, Spencer Brinchman, and me, Sarah Shahid, with original music by Benjamin Bilkin. To read and listen to more from Spring, and to find out how to join the Spring Socialist Network, please go to SpringMag.ca.